This introduction to the podcast is being recorded at 2 on Tuesday. And you need to say that because by 2 we could not have a Prime Minister anymore. It's extraordinary how things are falling apart. We have just spotted that Jess Phillips, for example, has resigned. And yet Keir Starmer is still our Prime Minister. So we look at all of that, the runners, the riders, the rumours about Wes Streeting, a possible soft left candidate, but who could it be? And the certainty that none of that is really going to take Labour out of the doldrums in which they find themselves. But that overshadows our own elections. What next for the SNP? Is it right to exclude reform from talks? What significance will Wales play for Scotland in what comes ahead? There's an awful lot to talk about. Those are just some of the headlines. Now for the podcast.
Well, hi folks, and welcome to this week's Lesley Riddick podcast. In the words of the great and sadly late Alex Salmond, Lesley, I heard a rumour. I think we won the election.
I know. Well, I have to say, you and I were just having a little bit of a kind of smug moment, I have to say, before we came on air. I don't know why it just feels wrong. Perhaps it's just upbringing to kind of be, or just, it's just to be smug in public. It just seems to be absolutely smug before a fall, but still, having had to sit through all that freaking Labour stuff from 2024 and the mandate they got, and all of them wooden to the core in the way they communicate. I mean, my stepdaughter has just texted me in from abroad where she lives, and she said, serious question, why are these people so completely wooden? Don't they realise it stops any kind of sense of identification? And it's funny, in the midst of everything we'll talk about, which is very political, how it's actually quite a sort of almost, there's almost something quite behavioural about it as well, especially if you're actually listening or watching Keir Starmer's really hopeless speech on Monday. And I know it was there's nothing in it, but it's just interesting to see how he just can't look like he means anything. He just can't do it. And
but
what he did do,
off.
Exactly, that's all we're looking for. It's pathetic. But there's just all these little things. First of all, his big hurrah was about saving Scunthorpe, which actually nationalising potentially British Steel, which apparently the government already runs Scunthorpe. So nice one. But the point is, for a Scottish listener, what are you not hearing there?
Well,
you're not hearing Grangemouth, and you're not hearing Mossmoran. So it's kind of like, we can see all these kind of formerly nationalised industries now as private companies splashing around in the water, drowning, and taking the jobs down with them. But actually, we can only lift these guys out. And funnily enough, they happen to be in Englandshire. So that kind of gets your dander up from the start. He then had this long peroration about people doubting him. Then it was kind of, instead of sort of saying, look, I've made mistakes. So fair enough. It was all that I'll prove them wrong. So it's kind of like you're basically saying then that as we record today, 81 at latest count Labour MPs who want you to resign, and an electorate that in every single part of these islands except Northern Ireland that wasn't voting expressed their complete dissatisfaction with Labour in a variety of ways, right? They're wrong. You're going to prove them wrong. What are they wrong about? You see, after a while, it's like the kind of consumer, the customer is always right. The freaking voter is generally pretty right as well. And then he goes on to say, there's another little bit coming, and he said, yes, we made mistakes. Oh, sorry, we made mistakes. So he can't even own up his own part in this. Suddenly he's collaborative when it's kind of taking pelters, and then it's kind of like, I'm going to prove them wrong when it's climb every mountain, ford every stream rubbish. So I really struggle not to swear today. And, the other thing that other people noticed was, okay, so he didn't mention his toolmaker dad, though he got close to it and had got a little kind of chuckle for going, oh, don't worry, I'm not going to go there. See, that's not even funny either. Just don't touch it.
This is not going to be as crap as normal. Yeah.
So then he started talking about my brother Nick. So it turns out, in this endless quest to sound normal, which would have been easier, Keir, if you hadn't taken the knighthood. I mean, everybody that rolls in to talk about this is Lord something, Sir something, and they're all talking about how, they come from a working background. Nobody can say the word class these days in case it sounds a bit socialist. It's utterly annoying, all of that stuff. And then his other big reveal. So he starts talking about Europe and you think, Jesus, he's going to do something really wild here. He's going to say, we're going to join the customs union or we're going to join the single market or something. No, we're going to be put at the heart of Europe.
With a summit?
What what an underwhelming lot of rubbish. I mean, within minutes, of course, it was interesting listening to the analysis of it. And this is also a comment on the whole election. We will get there, folks. But, the media and the press in Scotland need to have a bit of a think, because overwhelmingly, in fact, completely anti-SNP to a paper, apart from the National. And they're serving cities that pretty much voted SNP Green. So you might want to have a wee think about that. But the whole wisdom after that speech wasn't really a bad speech. I mean, I can't remember who it was in The Guardian, John Crace, who's normally fairly on the money, had actually said a thing like that was one of his best speeches. And I thought, are we just on a different, wavelength completely? Other folk were coming in, I mean, to the point and saying, I think Richard Murphy, there is no change in the economic orthodoxy. And we'll come on to this here because it seems there can be no change, because otherwise you wake up the markets, they start going, ooh, Liz Truss, I feel it all coming on again. And then you can't change. But you can't change leader because everybody's scared that if there's any kind of change from the wooden tops, you will end up antagonising this massive beast that sits in the corner. Look what a great job it's done for us so far. So you can forget your Andy Burnhams and you can forget even the complexity of him coming back to Parliament and having to kind of, get somebody to jump off the top of the cliff. There was rumours for a while that Clive Lewis was prepared to do that. Clive Lewis, a very decent left MP, Norwich South, I think. Actually, somebody looked at the election results for Norwich South in the local elections. Labour came third. So, Clive Lewis could be doing this selfless thing, although he's come back and said, look, I didn't say that. And so it's astonishing how rumours are developing really strongly and then people are coming, going, not me, mate, But even so, what would be the point? If everybody now knows this is the litmus thing for Labour, Andy Burnham getting back in, there'd be some hell of a tactical voting going on in Norwich South, and there already is. Labour is third. So it's kind of like, the idea from Starmer was just, his basic thing was we just must try harder. And really, we're just so past that. So anyway, where we are today, do you want to talk for a while?
Well, just to say that in 2024, which is obviously the last comparable Westminster election, Clive Lewis was actually down 5.9% on its previous election result. So whilst there was obviously a Labour landslide across the country, we know that was all on fairly shaky ground. Not that 47.6% of the vote is shaky, but it was down by 9.7% away. Was our swing of 9.7%? It was down by 5.9% in.
But this is almost too many numbers, actually, Fraser.
Totally. I mean, if you just think about it, it wasn't as if they were sort of a thundering fourth in Norwich South in 2024, never mind the local elections, which people might think was a bit more disposable and less important in people's voting lives. And, this was 2024 was a kind of critical election, a kind of get you a new government election. By-election is not going to do that, and there's nothing people like more than thwarting the best laid plans. So, this kind of, I'm going to sort of shuggle myself in here, and you guys are just going to have to acquiesce and make this a priority for you because it's a priority for me. I don't think would go down at all well anywhere in the country, and it's certainly not going to work particularly well in the place where you're kind of on a retreating vote share.
Indeed. But I mean, having listened to, Radio 5 Live have got a kind of running commentary with people standing outside and different versions of what happened in this morning's cabinet meeting coming out. The main message seems to be that Keir Starmer had basically just looked at the existing agenda defence, a couple of other things, had gone, right, defence, and just gone straight through the normal agenda as if nothing had happened. And some people had reported just refused to even discuss any criticisms or anything to do with his future. And after the meeting, when a couple of ministers went to try and speak to him, he just walked past them. So he seems to be going, I see no ships. There's no problem here. And, he's just absolutely determined to kind of see this out. And you'd have to say, everybody seems to have just absolutely tied themselves in knots on this, because there's the kind of Wes Streeting was apparently seen walking out with a face like Fizz, which many people commented was not like his normal beaming, cheery self, which would seem to, on his own, which might suggest that, basically he can't move. And it's up to him now to decide if he's going to put up or shut up, isn't it?
Well, yes, and also if you don't move, then you've not moved and you can't do it again, because you don't really get, future opportunities at this sort of thing. And then at some sort of cabinet reshuffle, you just get put out because the Prime Minister has to reflect his authority? Or do you stay in there because the Prime Minister doesn't want to be seen to be getting rid of major rivals in that way? And then you end up just being kind of Nicky Naymates because your faction are still on the outs and you're not sort of taking forward the project with the rest of us. And so, yeah, it's a kind of sticky situation. I don't see there's any credible way in which Andy Burnham could come in. So you really are talking about Wes Streeting or Angela Rayner, or one or two lesser knowns. I see in the BBC are saying that interest rates are already up today, and the effective interest rate on government borrowings, this has hit a 10-year, the 10-year gilt rate, so there's a borrowing over 10 years, so these are kind of longer gilts, is 5.13% today, which is not levels not seen since the 2008 financial crash. So the market's already kind of jittering in a bit of pricing into medium-term interest rates. So yeah, fun times.
What they've been talking about is that Angela Rayner has sort of bombed herself out with her tax problems, and that if Wes Streeting, it is like I wish I did play chess. Actually, I never learned it. Stuck at drafts with my dad, and then chess looked a bit too complicated. But I can feel a chess sort of reproduction on this one. Because, here's Wes Streeting. If he decides to stand, he will immediately get countered by the soft left, as they put it, in the Labour Party will feel obliged to put a candidate up. If it's not going to be Andy Burnham, it'll have to be somebody else. He actually, even if he, the saying is that if he was to sort of just to take the mantle unchallenged, it would absolutely damage his authority anyway, because everybody would say you couldn't win a contest and you just dived in before, Andy Burnham could come back in. So that hangs over him forever. So it's almost in his interest to have a contest. And who would the contest be then? And now they're starting to talk about Ed Miliband. You're going, oh my God. I mean, no.
That was a tried and tested thing. That has been demonstrated.
It just didn't work. And actually, in a funny kind of way, since I can't remember what it was that old Ed was actually leader of the party. But
remember, there was the Ed Stone.
God, yes, that's right. Yeah, the Ed Stone.
Which then got sort of quietly buried somewhere because Ed had the sort of election mantras. That was the biggest gravestone, never mind the biggest suicide note.
Independence thermometer, but anyway, let's not get into stuff. But anyway, so and the thing is, since Ed had that sort of brush with, leadership campaigns and so on, it seems to me he's become more and more sort of like a caricature of himself, the way he speaks and the kind of almost frenetic kind of, delivery stuff, because he's let go, he's not going to go. Doesn't have to look like a gravitas-y prime minister. So he's just being himself, and he just, that's not going to work. It really isn't. So they're going to have a struggle to find somebody who would fit within the soft left, that fits all the bills and doesn't scare the markets enough that the jitters go kind of mega jittery. But it does kind of make you wonder then, can we ever have any different kind of government fundamentally if we're all going to be like this about it? If everybody is going to, if there was an absolute honey of a candidate sitting there ready to go, perhaps people would say, look, the markets can go swivel because actually everything's going to pot anyway because of, uncertainty and so on. But, it feels as if we're just locked in this perfect storm that once again, coming back to this chess analogy, there's some sort of just checkmate and you can't move. And yet, if you don't move, if they sit in this pickle every time Keir Starmer, I mean, he's already had to rise Parliament a week early, so he didn't have to have another Prime Minister's questions. And I don't know, is he on tomorrow? Let's think of they're back. They are back, aren't they? Because it's the King's Speech tomorrow.
Yes, I mean, all the hoo-ha around that, I mean, that takes up, all day, and then there'll be the kind of loyal address type stuff around the King's Speech. But of course, the King's Speech ought to be the opportunity for the government to set forth its new programme for government. And this should be a really kind of critical reset moment. You'd almost think if you were the monarch of this small northern European country, you might be saying, well, I'm not turning up to do a King's Speech because you want me back again, in 2 months' time to do another one. I think you better just sort yourselves out and then let me know once you're at a kind of steady operating state, because no point me jumping in the horse and cantering down there if this is all going to be a bit shoogly.
But, I mean, the thinking seems to be that if there was something, incredibly dynamic and interesting to be revealed in the King's Speech, probably, Starmer would have done it on Monday. So, you'll have had your King's Speech. That was it.
And then, of course, there's the shiny baubles of having appointed Gordon Brown and Harriet Harman over the weekend, which was, of course, the first kind of major post local election and devolved election move, was to bring Gordon Brown and Harriet Harman into new government roles, describing them as future looking, getting people from the past to look at the future. And Gordon Brown has got some kind of roving responsibility on defence and global finance, and Harriet Harman to advise him on women and girls.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny how, as we've said before, how quickly everything moves, because I mean, I just saw that, and I should put a tweet out just saying, oh dear, with a picture of Gordon sitting beside Keir Starmer. But it's almost like that's history already. Have you even seen them together anywhere, apart from that one picture?
That one picture, and Gordon, I have to say, looks every one of his 75 years when he actually comes down the steps of Downing Street. And even the yesterday speech, barely warranted a mention in the media. And of course, we're now totally past all of that into what are the cabinet doing, and we've got all these junior sort of backbenchery types, the ministerial aides resigning, and now looking to the cabinet to see who's going to jump first.
In the midst of all that welter of just numbers and people and folk that you've hardly heard of, and my God, even some Scottish Labour MPs said something. I mean, wow, it's an astonishing thing that you look at this person and name it, you don't recognise, Scottish Labour MP, and you think that's actually the first time I've spotted you saying anything. So, whatever. But the people that resigned apparently were very much Wes Streeting's folk, because there's the folk who are sort of trying to cause an immediate upset. No, he's the only guy lined up ready to go. And the folk who are doing, as Catherine West, is now doing, not being a stalking horse, but sort of saying, we want this transition to September. Anyone who talks about transition is an Andy Burnham person. And yet, there's as many people are saying, there's just, there is no hero. There is nobody cantering to the rescue. It's a total freaking burrock. It really is. So that's them.
I'm hopeful they're having a lovely time. But,
meanwhile, at Westminster, Dave Duggan has been appointed the new Westminster leader, because obviously Stephen Flynn is up the road.
Yep. So, I mean, that's an internal ballot of the SNP's parliamentary group, so elected by the group rather than appointed, and I think that's a really good decision. Dave's a great guy, and
it was apparently unanimous. Which I could quite see, because I mean, having watched, I forced myself to watch Prime Minister's Questions every week because it comes on the day I have to write a column, and I've got to say, Dave's been pretty blooming useful actually. He can fairly get in and about in the Stephen Flynn sort of tradition, so that's a good appointment. There's one solid performer in Westminster anyway, and Stephen Flynn back up here, and there's all the excitement to come on this. There is a heck of a lot of new people, and some pretty useful new people actually. And much as I was beginning to feel quite droopy actually before the election, because it just felt like sort of play it again, Sam, I'm almost daring to get my dander up again with this, which is partly because of the Hingaboot that we did, Operation Hingaboot, on the night on Friday. And God love everybody that turned up with those tall flags. Excellent. it turned out that it looked like the BBC or somebody had got worried about us because there was a really high fence there, which I've never seen before. So it looked like also somebody from the tented village, the media village, came over once we started singing and such like to complain to the Holyrood authorities, who then got the police to come over and say to us we couldn't attach flags to the to these, their
physically attach them, to which they just took them off and held them next to it instead. And
actually, happy days. Once you really kind of got a sense of what you'd got there, because everybody had got these really long. I've got a fly swatter like this that extends really beautifully. Actual dancer of a piece of kit, because people had got these things extended and could then lean them against this high, otherwise you'd have had to have stood with them for an hour and a half, whereas they weren't, limber enough to keep running around every 10 minutes. So the fence was a perfect prop. And you spotted afterwards that actually there was a piece that James Cook wrote, and we will stick it in the note, that sort of said, there was a small group of people waving saltires and singing that wafted across to the media village. And the thing is, I've got to say, as somebody who, did have that job, I knew that would be it. And also that even I think you were there when Catherine Sampson from Channel 4 News, we were waiting for her to do her piece. The lights went on where we could clearly see her. And we thought, right, so we did more of our, Flower of Scotland, waving the flags. And when the lights went off, we thought, right, job's a good one. There we go. An hour and a quarter. Thank you very much. And so as we were walking past her, actually, to go back to, cars, etc., the lights went on and she was clearly about to go again. So she was looking around back to where we'd been. I think she was basically wanting that level of activity.
I've just composed in my mind a thing to refer to you guys.
Exactly. She puckered off. So we were almost beside her at that point. And I must say, I shouted over and said to her, Catherine, are you missing the music? We can sing from here. And so she actually laughed and just waved. It's worth doing. It is worth doing. And please people, think about this, because you can have 200,000 people on the street on a Saturday and nobody's there because they're not, because we haven't made news, because the cameras aren't there, it's overtime, it's Saturday, there's no bulletins. When they're there anyway, come. Next time, come. And next time will actually probably be quite soon. Was the next thing that was quite slightly surprising was the announcement by John Swinney that despite the fact they didn't get the 65, the fact that there is an independence parliament with the Greens means that there is an intention to move ahead with this vote for a Section 30 order request that would happen as soon as practicable, which, that's another bit of a moment. And actually, maybe I am somewhat preempting the Time for Scotland little discussion we're going to have tonight about tactics and so on, but it's entirely possible that we ought to be hanging about then because the cameras will be back. And my thing about this is, if the cameras are on Holyrood, we're on the street. And you only need 100 people with those brilliant flags to make an impression. But of course, if more people would get off their bahookies, and I quite realise it's a journey. I had to come down from Dundee. People have day jobs, totally get that. But happily, tea time newses are located at just after 6 and just after 7. So if you're in Edinburgh and the call goes out again, please think about just swinging past.
Well, I think it had an excellent backdrop, and it was in very timely because the First Minister, John Swinney, was being interviewed on the BBC in their big studio, and all of the background had us in the backdrop. It was obviously there for
happily,
lives.
Better than us, it had saltires, so that you couldn't see a face. All you could see was a little sea of saltires, which is exactly what you want.
Yeah, to have actually not only just penetrated the backdrop, which is kind of like things that we couldn't frame out. We've tried jiggling them round in the opposite direction to try and get rid of you. But to have the BBC actually refer to it in text in their article was quite unprecedented, I felt, and really meant that it had obviously penetrated and done well. It's because
most of the journalists they're trying to make this thing a bit interesting. And so because the trouble is, because we've had this mandate 4 times already, this is now the 5th one, I think, they're trying to find something to sort of colour this up a bit. And so, there is an open door there. I know everybody has got they're thinking about the BBC. And let's be honest, it's just the coverage of the Keir Starmer speech, which was on Connie McLaughlin's morning show or something on Radio Scotland. They listened for about 5 minutes. It was almost as if somebody got bored and they came out of it before he moved on to his big three offers. And I just thought, for God's sake, and I'm not blaming her, because this will be an editorial decision. We're just dipping in a bit, and then we'll get on to the light-hearted, sort of tickling brush nonsense of the
of course,
day.
yes, we've not heard anything. And what do you think about, dog mess on the streets? Phone us on 01.
For one day, when you've actually got, a really big pivotal moment like that, and it falls into your time. I mean, God, when I was there, you would be going, yeah, this is it. Let's just stay on air. And that's, the thing is, there's Radio 5 Live does that. But the point is, not a word about Scotland or Wales. Not a word. And in Starmer's speech, not a word. It only came in one of the questions, which was about Wales. And somebody that was interviewed just thereby from Wales made a point about Wales and Scotland, so that if the Welsh pop up, they're happily, we're double dunting now. Every time one country pops up, they're mentioning the other. But, in the great scheme of things, and maybe people feel we've done the same, concentrating on Keir Starmer and the English stuff here. But, the other point about that was, so there's Scotland. It has now an independence parliament, and it seems to be planning, happy days, to move forward with what was intended to have a Section 30 vote. And when do you think that might be, reader of the runes?
Well, I think that will be dragged out as long as possible. Is my hot take on that. There's a lot more to be gained by sort of slightly delaying that, because I'm not sure that they have a...
Will they do it before the summer?
They certainly have to do it before the summer, because I think it would just be ludicrous to wait longer, having said that you're going to do it as early as practical. But you've got a lot of shenanigans to be had before that. There's going to be the swearing in. You've got to get the election of the presiding officer. You then have to have the vote on who's going to be the first minister, and albeit that's a foregone conclusion, it still has to go through the parliament. Then there'll be a couple of days of press around the cabinet, and then the second day on who the ministers are going to be. So there's kind of a lot of footering around to be had. And of course, you possibly don't want to be making a Section 30 order request, so you know who it is that you're putting Dear X on to at the top of your letter.
Yeah.
Dear Keir, could you please leave this in the in tray for whoever's coming behind you?
I think it would be,
I'm not too sure when.
Obviously there's all of that, but there's sort of, I didn't think it was likely that anything would sort of lift my mood about this and get me thinking, game on again, actually, and then looking around you. And it's weird because, I mean, I've been wittering on about the Welsh dragon Plaid effect since I went and spoke there in November, actually. So it's funny how sometimes you're saying something, but it's almost like you don't take it on board. But suddenly when you're sitting there and you're saying Plaid has absolutely thumped Labour and Reform, and it wasn't close, they really beat Reform. Now, okay, tactical voting, yada, yada, whatever. But they're in, and the bit that really got me was watching them, Runa Pjoreworth, and it says something that I mutter Runa Pjoreworth to myself a lot, so that when the moment comes, I don't make a mess of his name. But he was, standing on the steps of the Senate with all his AMs, the members of the Parliament there. And there was a big kind of crowd of, supporters and whatever. So he was making a speech to them. And within the crowd, I'm sure you'll have seen this, folks, but we'll put the wee link up. Within the crowd, they basically had started singing their national anthem in Welsh. And it was just slowly acting like a kind of backdrop. And then you could see, because there was all his folk behind him, they all start singing. And there's a point where he just decides, I can't speak over this. And it's a combination of, there's no point in this. And actually, there's a bigger calling, is the national anthem gets you to stand up, really boom out, get the harmonies going. I mean, by gum, these guys can sing, and it's such a brilliant tradition that they've got, which I have to say contrasted a wee bit with our guys on the Friday night. Everyone can sing Flower of Scotland, and that's it. That we tried everything else. Freedom come all ye, I get it, it's difficult. Cap in hand, people can do about 3 lines of that, haven't got the rest of it learnt. Mountain Time, nope, I was on my own with that one. So actually, somebody did suggest that we print or put links to a couple of songs and just say to people, seriously, it is worth trying to learn this stuff. Because people say, oh, we need a song. Well, bloody learn the ones that are there, actually. And top songs back in the day was print them out. This may be a bit old school. Stick them beside the loo. You will find that you spend a little bit of time there where your mind is wandering. Just learn a verse at a time. And next time, let's have 4 or 5 songs we can sing, because it really does lift the spirits. And it was the singing that attracted the attention of those BBC guys. So come on, folks.
Polly Pocket in the shower is another great tip for that. I think it's either Women for Indy or Pensioners for Yes, as they were leaving, were saying, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to have this every month at our meeting now. We're just going to start by singing Freedom Camogie until we've got it down pat, so that if we go anywhere, we're kind of ready to rock. So,
but to be fair to the Edinburgh Wifey gals, I mean, they were singing Freedom Camogie, not bad. Yeah. But the trouble is, they were. I mean, this is me being deeply offensive, but they were doing it in a sort of a quietish way. I mean, you do need I said, come on, everybody, grasp your inner Glaswegian or Italian or something. I mean, just emote, darlings, emote. Let's get it out there. So, but and actually, just by the by, this thing about culture is so strong, because that is really, it's obviously made such a big difference to Plaid. It's not that Plaid have got exclusive ownership of the Welsh language, because as we've mentioned here before, I mean, at the Caerphilly by-election, the only candidate that didn't speak Welsh was the Labour candidate, which is unprecedented, actually. And in fact, Vaughan Gethings, who was the Labour First Minister, that probably caused the stumble and decline that they find themselves in now. Interestingly, he was the first Labour First Minister, and there only have been Labour ones. So the first that didn't speak Welsh either. There's something about you've got to be able to speak Welsh in Wales to throw 6 to start. It doesn't get you right over the line, but you kind of start without it. And that's such an incredibly powerful thing. I went to see, just by the by, there's a little detour, a film on Sunday, made by Rob MacNeacail, who is the son of Angus. Many people will know him, the late Angus Dew. He was dubbed this because he turned white-haired quite early in his life. So in the kind of cruel way of the Gaels, they called him Black Angus for most of his life. But anyway, Angus MacNeacail, tremendous poet, and Gerda Stevenson, totally fabulous poet and author of many books, but principally Quines is the one that many will have heard. So Rob, bit of a chip off the old blocks, and he's basically produced this film, The Psalm of the People in English, which is about Gaelic psalm singing and that tradition. And when you hear it, it is such a kind of spine-tingling thing. At the end of the showing in Edinburgh, he got us to stay behind, and for 40 minutes we learnt to do Gaelic psalm singing, with him putting the line out and then us following it incredibly slowly. And it's an extraordinary thing to do, actually, and completely unique to Celtic culture, because the film shows him going from various places in Scotland. He's living down in Carlops on the border with a posse there. His father came from Skye, so they were up there. They were over in Lewis, actually. Maybe Angus was actually from the islands, because I think he's buried across in the Western Isles, so they were there. And then they went to Ireland, and it was kind of seamless with a different Gaelic and a different tradition. He was up in pulpits in Ireland, which takes, that takes a bit of confidence. And actually getting them to do the psalm singing where the congregation repeats the line that's handed out by the presenter. And by gum, they did it with a slightly different Gaelic, obviously, in Irish Gaelic. And there was something so beautiful, actually, about that. Just this is seeing the culture of the Gaeltacht, essentially, in action. And you can still be part of it. So there's a website. They've got the film on in cinemas around the place, and we'll put up, the link will be on the notes here if you want to go. It really is an amazing watch. So please do it. Anyway, my little deviation over now.
Jolly good. Well, we'll certainly get the links up to that, and it sounds fantastic and really interesting film. The election was only 3 days ago, but it seems like a lot longer than that. I can't believe that the Highland Council have not apologised for their lacklustre accounting ability, and the fact that
they did actually.
Did they? Well,
did you not? With your, because this annoyed the hell out of you, didn't it?
Oh,
they were so
had
slow.
Me absolutely fizzing. I suppose as somebody who's normally standing there thinking, "Oh, for God's sake," because you're completely exhausted. At least you would have thought, well, you're in a daytime count, people are not going to be completely exhausted. There were umpteen counts across the country where candidates had to be just sent home, candidates for the regional list, because they were still at it. And the most at it ones were Highland Council, which albeit they have to get results in from the Earts and Pearts.
They did explain, apologise and said they would look into this, but they offered up the explanation that they expected that almost every constituency would be so close that they sort of did double counting while they were at it to make sure that there was no recounts. So that seems to be the argument. I know that doesn't satisfy anyone, and obviously it wasn't good enough.
Butter's no parsnips with me, I can tell you.
Yes, I think everyone can get that.
1:30 in the morning, I had to stay up till, and then you
didn't have to, sweet pea. See, that's the point. Well, you didn't have to. God damn it. Anyway, listen, if we're going to go on to parsnips, what about Anna Sarwar? Go on. You're not interested. Sarwar. You're still attached to your Highland Council rant.
Well, I'm just going to say the best thing about that, when they finally came to do the results on their live YouTube, they hadn't actually put the bloody sound on. And luckily, somebody recognised just before the critical information was actually given out. But for the first few seconds or minutes, they still weren't broadcasting the sound. Anyway, you go with the next Mr. Sarwar.
Well, yes, there was an
He's still hanging on.
He is. And that's prompting quite a bit of debate as well. There was an interesting Scotland Tonight last night with, discussing all of that. Actually, before that, Andrew Tickell wrote a humdinger of a column in the National about this. Again, link will go up. But, it really is quite a stinging rebuke. But his line is, the idea that Sarwar and Bailey can avoid responsibility for their choices and their campaign is risible. If you make an election campaign almost entirely about yourself and that crashes and burns, you cannot lay the blame elsewhere. And it's interesting to note how, and you think this is something you'd said, wrong campaign, because it was absolutely aiming at getting first past the post seats. Apparently, Annas had thought that just picking up lots of stuff on the list didn't give you the authority you need to be able to be First Minister. And since that was the go for gold thing that he's been talking about for the last 100 years, that was the strategy. So it was all aimed at getting you to vote, in constituencies, which is not where the Labour vote was going to be. So that it looks as if, many people might, who are going to vote Labour, such as it is, were voting in the constituency bit and then thinking, well, we've done that, let's vote for somebody else on the list. So it looks like that was a completely wrong move. And somebody has done the maths. This is normally your bit, my dear. Noticing that they had 19% of the vote in the constituency bit, and just 16% on the list, which is where basically they should have been. So it's kind of no. And the thing that's also striking about all of this, which again, I've got to say, Andrew Tickell's article really thumps on very interestingly about, is the friendly press that Anna Sarwar has had for the past 5 years. Andy McKeever was on, the kind of former Tory spin doctor, who sometimes, much of the time, speaks reasonable sense. But he was picking up the other commentator, Liz Lloyd, who was Nicola Sturgeon's right-hand woman, who was basically saying Anna Sarwar played a really bad campaign. And there was a sort of mansplaining, rousing Andy McKeever, basically saying, it was 100% Keir Starmer. That was the problem. Nothing to do with Anas Sarwar.
Wasn't it Dicky Birds? What a load of rubbish.
Exactly. I've got here Andy McKeever pro-Sarwar bullshit written down just to remind myself.
You put that in block capitals.
Yes.
I mean, what a complete load of tripe. The campaign could not have been more centred on Sarwar, as we've been saying, the mandamification of Sarwar. They even managed to get press coverage of the type of campaign they were running, never mind what they were actually saying. You know, oh, look at this exciting social media, and, you know, the Labour Party are way ahead in its techniques and its, software and blah, blah, blah. They've also had, you know, any amount of friendly press that they would have wanted had they wished to have floated an idea or two.
Yeah.
And tried it out, you know, and as we've said in the past couple of weeks, all of these adverts were, you know, vote for me to make change about change for changing the change so that we can change the Scotland for changing this. And you're like, what specifically, or even just generally, are you going to actually do? And they'd nothing to offer. I mean, I've had a pal looking for me to try and see if we could dig into some of the spend. And in the short campaign, so that's sort of January to now, or to the polling day, Labour spent something like 104 grand on Facebook. We can only identify currently 3 grand on YouTube, which we think is completely wrong, and does rather suggest that YouTube is not actually all that a transparent place to find out what political ads are being run, and another 7.5 grand on Snapchat. So they could have been running a much better Both Votes Labour campaign, should they have chosen to, and quite self-evidently ought to have done, because unlike the SNP, it would have actually helped them. And really not a huge amount of competition there for Reform, who seem to have spent next to nothing, and it'll be very interesting to see their return, which makes me highly suspicious about Reform. And I certainly wouldn't want to be giving them any tips about how to do better in the future. But Reform, I am pretty sure, have taken a conscious decision not to do better at this election. And I suspect that was because they looked around and thought, Christ, if we get one on the list, that will be quite fine. That's our number one list person. If we get 2 on the list, that person is not as good as the number one person, but gee gosh, if we start getting 3 or 4, we're going to really look like Charlies, because these people are absolutely off their head, and we're going to have to spend longer finding better candidates. Now we look like more of a thing. They could have really gone nuclear. They could have got some right-wing American bods over to show them how to do proper digital campaigning. I've not seen anything for them. As I said, I was in the West Coast in a top Reform target seat. The candidate didn't even take the opportunity to fill in the 250 words that they were supposed to do in the local paper. So they didn't, every other candidate was there apart from them. They didn't do any hustings. You talked about Shetland. I'm sure the Reform candidate, I think, just went across there to sign the papers and then was never seen of or heard of again. They were not really in this election at all. I mean, they're just being carried forward on the kind of national swing, and there's a huge amount of free press to get from the BBC and others. But at no level was this a political campaign, which is either going to be a great thing for 2029, they're just not going to be able to, carry it forward, or by the time it gets to 2029 in the UK general election, they're just going to have turned on all the switches of things that they've held off on, and we could be seeing a really seismic shift in electoral politics.
I mean, we should get on to John Swinney's decision not to bring them into the talks posse, but to still finish on the Anas Sarwar thing. Again, Andrew MacNeacail had this great line in his piece: Labour's social media campaign wasn't so much viral as contagious. And he basically points out that YouGov in April reported that Anas Sarwar had a 58% disapproval rating with the Scottish public, with just 18% having any warm feelings towards the Scottish leader. And against that backdrop,
let's pump more of him into people's eyeballs.
Sarwar, Bailey and wee Doogie decided to run a campaign exclusively on Anas Sarwar for First Minister. So it's kind of like all this stuff about, it's extraordinary how much there is this kind of tendency to attribute some kind of incredible secret powers to people who just aren't that good, actually. And I'll stop quoting this soon, but this is a really great bit from the column. Having been afforded every allowance for past failures, having been bolstered by broad and deep media support, puffed up and promoted, received fawning notices, sympathetic readings, and granted a campaign war chest of unprecedented size, Sarwar failed the one test which really mattered. He failed in a way which someone less sentimental about themselves would immediately recognise as career-ending. The magic not only faded but fizzled. The reputation cannot recover. Anas, you aren't a winner. You aren't the coming man anymore. You came, you saw, you lost. It's over. Now, that you would think, actually, that anybody within Labour would begin Scottish Labour. There's so many questions these guys need to be asking. And obviously, in a way, it's not for people that support independence, and given that Labour is still, not, they might just think, who cares about all of that? I've got to say, I did feel a bit sorry that Monica Lennon lost her seat. It's a very capable lefty, and I suspect a bit sympathetic. And she had actually won the contest, which she not only narrowly lost in 2021 to Anas as leader. Labour could be in a different position. And you might think, well, that's not good, is it? Because Labour being kind of, stuck with a kind of ineffective leader suits probably the independence cause pretty well, which is one way of looking at it. But, in time, we know 40% of Labour voters have been independent supporters. Somebody someday will have to take a decision about what they're doing in all of this. And I noticed, for example, that Paul Sweeney, who is a List MSP, I think he's still List for Glasgow, but he was interviewed and ended up saying that Scottish Labour should perhaps move away from blanket opposition to Indy Ref 2. Now, it was a slightly cryptic thing he said, that there should be an agreed approach that wasn't solely dictated by the SNP. So he's saying something like, maybe we should just agree something across the parties and settle that threshold so we can move on with the rest of our political debate. Now, you might just say, I don't know, Paul, if you haven't noticed, but we've just had an election. That's kind of a bit of a, threshold, and it's a bit of a way that we tend to decide things, and there's kind of a pro-independence majority. But the fact that somebody, you're beginning to hear these bits of thought, and there's got to be a challenge to Anas Sarwar. It's not conceivable that he's going to be able to stay in position. And with him, Jackie Baillie, I would imagine. She hung on, God love her, in Dumbarton. But that's got to be the past, especially when you begin to see the different faces moving in, the different young, successful faces moving in. I'll grant you, John Swinney is not, is not the young face. But, if you look at the Greens, if you look at a lot of the people like Hannah Mary Goodlad, that was a moment in Shetland that a lot of people didn't see coming. There's quite a few, new faces there, and it won't help for Anas Sarwar to be still mounting Labour's cause.
I think so at the moment they're saying that the Norwegian blue loves skipping on its back. It's that kind of Monty Python dead. That's perfectly fine. It's dead. It's clearly dead. The only thing they could really do now would be to actually separate themselves, and similarly, the Scottish Conservative.
I heard somebody discussing this and saying that actually, because, as in case anyone doesn't know, they are not a separate party or entity. I've forgotten what the proper
the branch name. Office for one thing.
No, there's a proper, sort of euphemism for
unit
it.
Of the Labour Party.
Exactly, an accounting unit. I am an accounting unit. So if they could set up a separate party, but somebody had pointed out they've got no money because they've got no members.
No, and this is a point I was going to come on to, because obviously this was a get the job done election. This was Labour in Westminster, Labour at Holyrood, and as I keep whanging on about, the Labour Party have been spending money on me to get them elected at Holyrood since the last of the Westminster election. So there was no gap in campaigning from the 2024 election to now. Now, normally there would be a sort of dead zone where you don't spend any money because you ain't got a lot, and then you would ramp it up before the beginning of the short campaign so that you could spend a load of money, and then you would spend whatever you were allowed legally to spend in the regulated period of the campaign, January to May. Now, they have been spending in East Lothian continuously. And it might just be that YouTube adverts are pretty cheap, but it's like £18 per 1,000 ads. It's, that racks up when you're putting that in regularly as they have into everybody's eyeballs. And that is only as a result of big financial transfers from the UK Labour Party, particularly to bolster the possibility of Keir Starmer staying in place. And Jess Phillips has just announced that she is resigning as a minister, which is kind of the first major people you could actually identify, on the street with your flashcards to ordinary folk. Who is this woman? So,
but you're forgetting, just before you move on, they got that massive whack from the Easdale brothers.
Yeah. But,
which that's where the money is come from. It's straight up reported more than £500,000. It was £500,000 that came from those James and Sandy Easdale, and it would seem the British Indian entrepreneurs Puneet and Poonam Gupta, which I thought they were part of the past. But anyway, they've had £500,000 and sunk it. So
and again, you only get that kind of money when you look like you're going to be the government, and it's worthwhile keeping you on board. And it's not worked. Mm-hmm. And I don't see that being replicated again in 5 years' time. And it's always a bit annoying when you've just won one election, people start talking about what you're going to do for the next one. But I think there's real big problems both for the Conservatives and for Labour, which suits us right down to the ground, of course, but does not necessarily represent a healthy democracy in Scotland.
Indeed. And I'm looking at actually another thing I've noted about Andy Burnham, which is circulating on Twitter, pointing out that in 2016, and okay, that is now 10 years ago, and before the Gaza war and the genocide, then Shadow Home Secretary Andy Burnham was one of the Labour MPs who, quote, flocked to support Labour Friends of Israel. And there's a lot of detail about advisors to him that were also people who set up Labour Friends of Israel. You can find all of that if you want to go into it. And there's a long list of all the people that he was basically, joined with. So that's basically quite a sobering thing. And I keep being astonished. Some people say you're just a soft twit, but basically you do keep being astonished. But that people just don't seem to rate Gaza. I mean, there was a fascinating thing on Channel 4 News where they were looking at the fact, this might seem like, just bear with me, folks, English local elections, 64 out of 136 councils now have no overall control. And remember, folks, that perhaps the only country in the world to use first past the post at local elections, which is mind-blowingly stupid, has produced, you see, it shouldn't be able to do this, but it has produced half of the councils with no overall control. So, when they did a report about this, the report was very much, this is a mess. Well, it's not so much a mess as this is reality. And, people having to kind of get their heads around how they would cooperate, whether they would cooperate. If you set up a system that expects, that talks about fairness and expects some cooperation, you will eventually get to a stage where you won't have people describing diversity as a mess, fundamentally. But in the midst of this, Darshana Soni, who's a brilliant communities editor for them, was interviewing a young chap. I think he was only 18 or something. And he was from a Muslim background. Gaza was an issue for him, but actually pretty much a lot of neighbourhood stuff as well. And he was part of an independent group that polled the same as Labour, the Lib Dems, whatever. That independent group in Birmingham, which is apparently Europe's largest council. I always thought that we had that kind of bragging rights here, but I guess by population, largest council. And that's what was produced. Gaza within that electorate is still a big enough issue that it produces a grouping the same actually as every other party. And just while we're at it, there's Pat and I always used to have our differences about Eurovision. Now we're on the same page because there's no way I'm watching it. There's a heat or something on tonight. No. And actually, maybe you wouldn't expect better from the BBC. They've decided to show it. They're part of the In With the Bricks crew. They think they can survive what will be now blatant, which was blatant before. But now we've had 2 years of it when the Israeli competitor sings and clearly a fake backing, fake room sound is applied to the backing of it because people are clearly booing. And I don't know what, is going to happen in terms of having to search people before They go in, so they've got absolutely nothing, even in their blinking underpants, any kind of Palestinian flag or whatever. But I mean, this is just beyond crazy, and nobody's even mentioning, and it's a news point, that many countries have pulled out of Eurovision. That is news. It's factual news, and it's different, which should make news, but it doesn't make blinking news. And I do hope people also spotted, if you were watching the BAFTAs, that the brilliant documentary Doctors Under Attack, which the BBC commissioned and then bottled showing, and Channel 4 picked up and showed, that one won an award. And the guy who was one of the guys who was picking it up said, you know, I'll bet you they edit out a lot of what we've said here. Sure enough, the BBC version of the speeches that were given, there's a couple of punchy points, but they edited it and they hadn't edited other contributors. So, yeah. I mean, honestly, it's all the sort of polite society, the whole damn lot of them are still missing how strongly people feel about this. And the fact they won't even pay acknowledgement to how angry and upset people are about our impotence in this. And then at the back of everything, we don't discuss much here, because what can you say left about, Donald Trump and Iran and Israel? So there we are, because we just didn't deal with this problem at the beginning when it was only Gaza and only Palestinians. We now have our own economy completely knackered, because Israel will keep going to the bitter end, even if Donald Trump decides to bottle it. So does nobody think that's worth, still there's nothing in there that's worth saying? I mean, anyway.
It is shocking. But before you launched into Eurovision there, I felt sure you were going to say Angus Robertson rather than Eurovision to keep on a Scottish political track. Obviously, I think that was a contributing factor to the loss of the constituency seat of Edinburgh Central, which is really an unprecedented win by the Greens. The SNP came not second to the Greens, but third behind Labour. Now, you could argue that Edinburgh Central had been changed quite dramatically under the boundaries, and some of the more kind of working class areas had been shunted out of that seat. I've not got it in front of me, but there was less of the sort of Gorgie Dalry and your sort of dummy dykes.
That's not true. Well, because actually I did look at this. I was looking, it was interesting as to what the account was. Again, good piece in the National on this. I think they've still got their 20 quid for a year's subscription, folks. It's well worth it. But anyway, there's a guy, Adam McGibbon, who was drafted in, who seems to have done a lot of the successful campaigns down south. So his thing was basically they've been working hard for years. They're saying for 2 decades, actually, but, let's call canny. But he's really dismissing the idea that it was a large student population in the new Edinburgh Central. And he said, I've seen various attempts in the right-wing press to write off this victory as just being about students, and definitely they're a factor. But he says, I also want to point out, we were doing our sampling on Friday morning and we won across the entire constituency. We won in Dumby Dykes. We won in Dalry. It wasn't just student areas where we were winning. Now, you can decide he's talking shite if you want, but I mean, well, I don't think you could have got that kind of level of vote from students who tend to be, not the best at turning out.
Well, what I was going to come on to say is you could form an argument like that, but there were far greater factors than simply just the change of boundaries. And it was Angus Robertson was a fairly invisible MSP, and I would say that he was no more assiduous in his constituency tasks than Ruth Davidson was as the previous incumbent, which the SNP tore apart for her lack of seriousness to being a constituency member rather than being the sort of national leader of the Tories, not having any kind of surgeries. Angus, of course, had kind of secretly eloped to Linlithgow and not really let on. There was a big hoo-ha about the fact he was only doing constituency surgeries over Zoom calls rather than meeting people face to face, because he was potentially not actually in Edinburgh to be doing them. There were the sort of serial failures as a minister, first with the census, and there was a whole host of other matters.
Culminating in that.
culminating in
terrible picture
and then
terrible meeting.
Yeah, which, spin it how you like. It came on the back of similar activity at Westminster with the Israeli team, the guy that was discovered to be a spy. So I think there were a whole host of more pertinent factors, and I would believe the Greens. I mean, the Greens were by no means any kind of credible electoral form certainly in the lead up to the referendum. They were not into organising things in Edinburgh because they just didn't have the capacity or the know-how to do it and wanted to tag along to the SNP. They've certainly been shown how to do things very well during that period, and some of that learning has transferred across. But even prior to that, I remember knocking up people in 20 kind of very Gigi parts of Stockbridge, and people saying, I think I'm going to vote for the Greens this time. It'd be nice to give them a chance. And you sort of step back and look at their townhouse and think, give them a chance to do what, madam? Because I don't think this is going to go well for you in the long term. But yeah,
but does
quite a result there.
And it is quite a result because, again, if you look at the narratives that the entire press were coming out with, Lorna Slater, thanks to the recycling bottle thing and various other stuff, was never going to be able to hold her face up in public again. You'd kind of imagine she would just think, politics, I had a go at it, but, maybe not. And yet there she was. She won this seat against all the odds, no matter what you want to say. And the last Kate Nevins, the one that says, the one that thought that prisons should be phased out, my God, she got, complete pelters. And okay, you can't phase prisons out immediately. But as we discussed before, every country that's grappled with their criminal population has pretty much come to the conclusion that the problem is not having stuff in the community, and that it costs a packet to stick people in prisons. So,
and that this was in actual fact an SNP policy in 2007.
Well,
8,
indeed,
9, 10, 11, 12, 13.
She pretty much just lifted the commission report that we produced in 2008 for Kenny MacNeacail, and just sort of said, that, except she just put a sentence further on it, and everyone went, oh, great, they're loonies, let's have a go at them. I don't know, because I wasn't a voter in her neck of the woods either, but, people seem to have either disliked the way that there's been a basically pile-on against people saying something. And here's another thing, saying something. And, back to this woodenness about pretty much everybody else. Now, okay, not everybody else, because clearly Reform have said something, particularly, and that probably brings us to, the decision to exclude them from these talks.
But just before we get into that, I am not necessarily a supporter of the Green Party, and it will now be sort of incumbent on them to show themselves as not a total clown show, having got these increased number of members. And there's been a lot of hoo-ha about the other list candidate, Keir Starmer, and his
visa
problems, which are kind of, I suppose, the defense of which are being kind of combined with the fact that he claims a trans identity, and that's been a big part of his identity in his campaign and the rhetoric at his acceptance speech. I don't think the two are necessarily overlap in terms of the criticism. It does seem slightly odd. It's a bit like sort of joining an organisation and then wanting to be part of the committee in the first meeting you go to. It's that sort of thing. I think this is much more to do with kind of fairness and whether this kind of policy, which is was voted for across the Parliament, actually kind of passes the pub test. To somebody who has a very temporary status in the country is allowed to vote. That seems fine. They're here, and that's obviously not going to be a big part of the electorate. But then to actually become an elected member in the national parliament and be at the whims of UKVI as to whether you can stay or not does seem a little bit odd.
I don't think so, actually. I mean, I know it seems odd, and it's easily whipped up and everything. If we're going to start to roll back on stuff that Reform can just pick at the corner of and begin to peel off, I think we'll end up with very little tablecloth. And I mean, the point to me, the thing is more that a stance the Scots have taken is a powerful and pivotal stance, which is that if you've basically lived here from 3 months, you are considered a voter. And that is so completely different from the ethnocentric approach of Westminster, which in Brexit was that you could only be a British, Irish or Commonwealth citizen. Anyone else could have lived here their entire lives apart from birth. And they got not a vote on that big pivotal thing. So if you're going to kind of just basically say, this is how we hang here, which is, and also that mirrors the New Scots policy of 2014, which I wish people knew more about, but we were all a bit busy that year. That decision, which then is reflected in the Kenmure Street kind of validation of people being neighbours and being okay wherever they came from, I am fully up for that. And to me, that is one of the most appealing parts of modern Scottishness. And I know it's up for debate and all the rest of it.
Well, I don't think it really is
really
up for debate.
strong.
I agree with that very much so. And I think that actually has a lot of credibility and a lot of sense to it. And you're part of the community. And we want to integrate people into our community as soon as they arrive, rather than waiting till they get a status, whatever that happens to be, whether they've come as a talented person on a visa or whether they're coming to claim asylum. The question really is whether it passes the kind of sense of the pub test, as I was saying, as to whether you're, having been here for a year doing a PhD or having your PhD supervised, are you able to then actually just become an elected member of Parliament, which you have to be able to stay in the country for 5 years when you've actually not currently got a status, a right to remain. Most other people in framing of that legislation is people who have indefinite leave to remain.
Forget the pub for a minute, right? Because as soon as just forget the pub for a minute. If you start to kind of go in and say, okay, we really get that people we're going to try and integrate people from when they arrive rather than waiting for settled status. And integrating means you can vote here as soon as you've lived here for 3 months, but not if you're going to stand as an MSP. Does that not sound a bit sort of wobbly? Because the point is, if that mattered enough to people, and I don't think that actually was a prominent part of his campaign, because I don't know, because I don't live. Is he Glasgow? See, I don't even know where he's from. But I think the thing is, he got elected because people voted Green. They voted for the party. And a lot of the thing.
So it really, a lot of the defence has been, he was democratically elected, and of course, in actual fact, it was a list vote. It was a party vote for a list of candidates.
Then you're kind of hoiking in and around the validation of list votes, so that if you don't, this is the system we've got. This lad will have to put up with whatever stuff's chucked his way as a performer. Now, that can bring the Greens down. If he manages to hold his ground well, it could say something. But he is a focus of attention. And I just think on trying to unravel a system to just stop him or the likes of himself is just too close to beginning to walk down a path that you can't even look in that direction myself, I would have thought. Anyway, we're going to have to agree to disagree on that one, I think.
Yeah, to me, it's really about the kind of cheapening of the standing of the Parliament, and I thought that was similarly.
Come on, with people like the Reform guys,
similarly at risk with the ideas that you were going to let 16-year-olds who also have the right to vote to become members of the Scottish Parliament, which was similarly sounds very progressive and sensible, and it comes from the extrapolation of the franchise into who should be allowed to stand, but doesn't necessarily actually make for the best elected member. And that's
very possibly. But point. The lad that I was watching in Birmingham, he was elected as a councillor. Okay, I can't remember if he was 17 or 18, and that's not 16. I'll give you that. But I mean, he made complete sense and was kind of having quite a bit of a laugh at the idea that all the oldies thought they were actually asking him if he was lost. When he went in, he said, "No, I'm a councillor. Actually, I've seen 16-year-old councillors in Norway." I mean, honestly, I just think we need to just get with it that, there's a whole variety and diversity in the world. And the sooner that you can just handle it coming forward. And if the Greens have made a mistake selecting him or he's made a mistake moving forward, they'll have to deal with that. But I mean, in a way, I think a lot of people will be watching to see what he actually says now, whatever. Now, can we please talk about Starmer and reform? Because I'm not sure about that one, about excluding them. Sorry, did I say Starmer? God damn it. Yes, Swinney and reform. What do you think? They sort of said we're not having... You see, to me, it's the way that this thing was communicated. Because if you actually, when you keep the thing high level and say, we disagree with their politics and it's racist or it's intensely, whatever was said about it, that's a bit kind of, whatever. The specifics of it was, if people remember, that in the most childish response I've almost ever seen in politics, after Malcolm Offord had a bit of a comeuppance at the hands of Ross Greer in a debate about his 6 cars and 5 cars, 6 homes, blah, 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 he then announced that they were going to have detention centres for illegal migrants, which is not a power the Scottish Parliament even has, but still, they would have these detention centres if they won, and they would put them in green constituencies.
Was it Offord that announced that or Farage? I thought it was Farage that announced it. But either way, that is the pivot point. So what are you arguing that?
So my thing would have been, if you wanted to exclude reform, you had to say what the line was that was crossed. Because, everybody watching has got their own different views. And actually, you might be right that it could have been a Farage rather than an Offord. We should have a wee look here while one of us is speaking. But, I mean, it certainly wasn't contradicted from this end. And I'm sure I saw the obvious riposte to it, that it couldn't be enacted in Scotland because we don't have powers over immigration, which suggests to me it was a Scottish reform move because it came straight after the Greens it was here. Because it was in response to the Greens basically taking a lump out of them. It was
Zia Youssef that actually made the announcement. I knew I hadn't seen Malcolm Offord.
Okay, right.
That's the thing about Malcolm Offord. He just seems to sort of stand at the sidelines of these guys going, well, I wouldn't have put that in the campaign, you understand, or I wouldn't have said it quite like that, but I am the leader. And you're like, well, come on, man. You're either in it or you're not in it.
I'd still like you to look at that because Zia Youssef is saying that in the context of Scottish, Welsh and English local elections, none of whom had the power to enact it.
Unquestionably.
So what was he saying? So what was the point? And again, you should be stuck with the same problem that you have in, as the Tories and Labour have had. It's the same problem, basically, isn't it? That if something happens and is said from Westminster, and it was said on the occasion of your vote, so it wasn't with reference to, 2029 when we have an election about that competent authority in Westminster, if that's being talked about and strangely announced the day after that tussle with the Greens, and where's the thing about saying these centres would be put in green areas? Who said that?
That's what I'm saying. Zia Youssef said that. That was their Home Affairs spokesperson.
Okay, so nonetheless, that could only have been in reference to, what had happened the previous night. So,
but
there's no getting away from it. You're hung out to dry by your Westminster leadership, whether you're Reform, Tories or Labour, and yet nobody did hang them out to dry on that. And I would still be with John Swinney saying this is the reason, that the kind of the idea that your party wants to round up illegal migrants in Scotland and stick them in detention centres, and also is advocating that within an election context where it's not even in the power of that parliament to do it. And you would stick it in the constituencies. You don't care how childish this sounds or vindictive, but you would stick this in the constituencies that dare to vote for your almost polar opposite party. Nice one, but
yep.
Unless you kind of put colour into it is the point I'm trying to make, and really nail the most extreme stuff that they are associated with. Because as you say, Malcolm Offord definitely ducks and weaves. And they tried all that racist stuff with Anna Sarwar in that Rutherglen by-election. It didn't work. So they backed off the racist stuff because it didn't work for them so well here. They've been trying all the other sorts of angles, and okay, that seems to have worked a bit better. But they still have to stand for the policy stuff that's coming from their UK party. So I think the way things are at the moment, it possibly does look a bit odd that, Swinney's having everybody else in if they'll come. I mean, I think already there's quite a few of them are kind of going, we're not lowering ourselves to come in and have talks about the future. It'll be forgotten pretty quickly, but I guess those people who did vote reform because they felt ignored will now feel justified.
Yes, I mean, the thing is, of course, they are the opposition. party, and at a Westminster system, you don't see a whole load of cross-party working. Obviously, this is as a result of the different dynamic we have in Scotland and the fact that we have a much more collegiate parliament and that we have a proportional element of it. But that allows them people who have not become elected to the government to put forward their position and to vote when things are tight and when legislation is difficult, and to horse trade with the business manager. No, we want our amendment because whilst we sort of agree in principle with this, we don't like these bits, and this needs to be watered down, and that needs to be changed before we could possibly accept it, and you're not going to get it through, or you have to then look to the other parties to find which amendment of your government bill is most palatable to you or makes most sense for the legislation. I don't think you've got this kind of automatic right of the opposition to be kind of like, well, we need to be having regular talks to the First Minister so we can get part of our programme taken forward, which seemed to be how I forget her name, the lady that they always put out. In fact, you had her when at the Rutherglen by-election. She was on the same panel as you, I think, for the BBC. This isn't very fair. They're going to be mean to us. And you're like, yeah, kid, you're in Parliament now. This might be a more collegiate system, but it's still oppositional. You get to have a.
But it's the way it was put forward, because, if John Swinney's saying, we fundamentally actually debate night, they had another debate night. My God, they've given it Laldi on Sunday, which honestly, folks, I watch all this stuff for you, right? But anyway, Sunday debate night. And the point was being discussed then.
Ben McPherson, I think, made similar points to me. It's just like, well,
the point that was being made was that the Tories are completely polar opposed to the SNP, and yet they're being invited in to talk. I think the point is, of course, there's the Westminster setup, but this is designed to be a proportion. Well, let's face it, there isn't an overall majority, so you're in a situation where you're going to have to do a bit of horse trading, and then there's some, there's questions. The Greens will probably be taking things within their party group quite to the left now, because that's the kind of, on economic and sort of services provision and blah, because that's how they won the election. Now, I don't know if that pulls the whole shooting match over to the left, because if they're doing deals, they'll want to have something more on that front. Or if Swinney basically is tacking the other direction, he's lost Kate Forbes, so he'll have to make a decision about who his deputy is, and that will say something. Or not? Do you think not?
There's no requirement to have a Deputy First Minister. And if you remember, there was no Deputy First Minister under Donald Dewar.
But that was before we got the double act in our system, and especially if you're, you'd wonder, because the amount of Mary McCallan that's been put about recently, when I couldn't, couldn't even be quite sure who she was actually for a while. And then suddenly she's been on absolutely everything that moved, would make you wonder. And I heard speculation this morning that either it would be Angela Constance or Shirley Ann Somerville to have one of the old hands there, but a woman. So there's a kind of man-woman kind of double act, which replicates the Kate Forbes thing. No? You're going to put a wee bet on it?
I'm just saying that, no, well, I would not put a bet on there being no Deputy First Minister. I'd just like to point out, for reasons of accuracy, that you can have the option of not deciding.
I do love you spending 5 minutes talking about something you won't put a fiver on. Yeah.
I think I was 10 point up the last time we started betting on things. I wouldn't get too cocky.
Yes, I think he probably will. And I think he probably would go for one of the old hands, as it were.
I do not think he would go for Angela Constance, although that would give you a more kind of real people vibe, just because of the previous ministerial problems. I don't know. We shall have to wait and see whether this is going to be a training academy or whether this is actually, you're my sort of representative on earth and this is how we're going to push forward the government. I mean, Kate Forbes did an enormous... the SNP would not be in the position that they are today electorally had Kate Forbes not actually sort of nipped around as Deputy First Minister, putting out fires, speaking to people properly and fixing things in the last however many months there were in the lead up to the election of the sort of year and a bit.
I've got to say, I mean, much as I did have, I just couldn't handle the level of things that she could not get her head around about people's relationships with one another. And I find that just a huge obstacle, actually. However, I did notice, she put a post up on Facebook thanking everybody and sort of saying, right, that's me, sayonara. And I mean, I read through all the comments. There wasn't a bad word said about her in something like 500 comments, which, that is quite something actually on social media. And you've got to say she, in that respect, she absolutely, just as you say, she did a lot of the kind of FaceTime stuff with people that, that maybe John Swinney hadn't got time to do, is maybe not his thing as First Minister. But then that question is raised as to what the function. You say doesn't need to be a deputy, but then hodding the badge that, the office that she hodded almost enabled her to have a bit of clout when she went to see people. Maybe
not
you'd
only
want
that,
to
but
have
to
that.
see people that wanted to talk about things that were somebody else's brief and then come back and go, I don't know why we're doing this stupid thing so stupidly, because this needs to have been fixed and should have been fixed ages ago. And why have you not sorted it out yet? Here is the 3 steps that you need to take to make this happen. Thank you very much. Kind regards. So, that kind of deliverability, which was sorely lacking under the Sturgeon, the Humza, and then to the sort of slightly lesser degree under Swinney administrations, will not have been aided by not having Kate Forbes in there. And we obviously have a new intake of people who have previously not been ministers, people like Stephen Gethins, I suppose to a lesser extent Alan Smith, Stephen Flynn, who obviously has a big media presence but has not actually run anything in the past,
quite.
being put in as MSPs and then potentially going straight into government or not going into government and thinking, but I'm a big beast, surely I should be in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, you're a big beast elsewhere. You're new to us, and you can be,
But the thing is, it's genuinely interesting. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And at the level to which I didn't expect genuinely interesting things to emerge from this, moments that actually might even have a bit of a kind of, a new bit of energy summoned up for it is interesting. Because there was last week it feels like 100 years ago, as ever these days, but I'd written a column that was actually, I got so annoyed about everybody saying what a boring election this was before the vote. And just by the by, I think the turnout was higher than 2011. So people might, be able to kind of come up with all the numbers of people that didn't vote. I'm afraid that seems to be par for the course with elections here. But it wasn't phenomenally. 2021 was a high turnout relative to the rest of them. So it's true, if you keep comparing it there, it was less. But actually, that was a high point in the rest of the time. 2011, that was a bit of a change election, I think people would agree. So this boring election thing, but the thing you've still got to think about in all of this is, the scunnerment factor. I mean, everybody was going on about being scunnered, and they're still doing it on that, debate night on Sunday. And it's almost like, here is the, the language that dare not speak its name, Scots. So you can't really talk, folk are not using much in the way of Scots in their language on TV and radio and so on. And indeed, I'm not here, to be fair. And yet you can toss in your one scunnered, and it's almost like people, wallowing in a nice warm bath. Scunnered. Yeah. We're doing with the kids. Look, scunnered. We can say scunnered. But the point is, I don't think, the scunnerment factor was not just a verdict on the SNP. It is actually a verdict on devolution. Because the Scottish Parliament is underpowered and pretty circumscribed. And to get out of any of the British doldrums that we're in, the Scottish Parliament is not a vehicle that was designed to be able to outrun Westminster.
No,
all you're ever hearing, but all those other parties was just, this isn't working, that's not working, there's not enough here, there's not enough there. And anybody could be sitting going, okay, so you've just rammed on about your extra 9,000 nurses or whatever it is you're doing, and you want tax cuts, and you're going to fund it from efficiencies. And that obviously isn't going to happen. But that's the point, because Holyrood wasn't designed to outshine the Mother of Parliaments or run the rest of Britain. It's just designed to tick over. And ticking over politics doesn't set the heather alight. So that's the problem with this, because half of us, those of us who have had our minds expanded somewhat about the possibilities of the country we could have, it's like playing with kind of half the Lego set or something without the corners, or playing with a kind of jigsaw that doesn't have any of the edges in. It's only half the game. And it's not that we're not interested in housing and drugs policy and all these things. They are core. But the ability to really get in and turbocharge a kind of result is pretty circumscribed. And the ability to put new parties into the mix, if the SNP doesn't limber up and come up with some more feisty solutions to things, like the much talked about Citizens' Assembly to bloom and tackle the council tax. If they don't move on things like this, still can't. We've seen you cannot produce new parties because of all the different reasons, but it's been tried and failed. And the folk from the Alliance to Liberate Scotland are having to live with, the fact that their vote was the difference in the Western Isles between the SNP retaining the seat and what happened, which was that they lost. Although I would absolutely put as a rider to that I think that seat was lost because of the ferry fiasco, actually.
Well, I mean, the numbers might tot up nicely, but 1 and 1 there does not make 2. That 159 people who voted for Alliance to Liberate were on the constituency were clearly not going to vote for the SNP in the constituency out of sheer scunnerment and a total sort of fed up disgust about the lack of progress on independence. So that 159 votes, I think, were entirely lost, and were given an outlet to vote for it rather than spoiling their ballot paper. So whilst the numbers are very cute, I don't think you can...
No, I'd agree with that. But the thing is, that is the only thing that actually penetrated. If we're getting back to your blimmin' pub lark, the only thing that anybody would be able to tell you in a pub quiz was just having noticed that correspondence. Yeah, so the point I'm just trying to make is how really difficult it is to create a new party that's got any chance of getting anywhere.
Yep, and also there's no shortcuts to that unless you actually have a new party which is kind of genuinely done the hard graft. And I'm not saying Alliance to Liberate did not in of themselves do a load of hard graft, and I would not, for me, wanted to have run a kind of list campaign in the way that they did. It would have been hugely exhausting, but to actually not see a vast amount of results, sadly, for it. The problem is that you just don't have the cash, and if you don't have the members, you're not going to have the money. Alliance to Liberate did put out an election communication. That was a great achievement on the list, but that was it. That you had one piece of material coming through your door for Alliance to Liberate, and really nothing else. It just goes to show you, though. I mean, Alliance ran almost entirely the same campaign and possibly with the same kind of spend as Reform did, but Reform are the new kids on the block, and they've been all over the shop and all over the press and media for free, being advanced and having them on the telly. It makes an enormous difference, and unless you get that kind of level of penetration, you're just not going to go anywhere. It's very unfair, but being right, unfortunately, doesn't let you win.
Yeah, indeed. And apologies if the sound has changed somewhat. I keep thinking my coughing fits are over. I thought, yes, it's gone. And then I just had another 2 minutes where Fraser manfully managed to talk for 2 minutes. And then when I put myself back on, I have totally changed all the settings on the recording. But we're nearly at the end anyway, because my God, we've fairly been talking today. My point with this simply is that scunnerment will only return. And, for the SNP, okay, there's things you can do, definitely, that will be less scunnering. And now that we've got to a stage where everybody is raising their game somewhat, and the Welsh, apparently, the first thing the Welsh want to do in talks with the Scottish government is adopt our Scottish Child Payment to Wales, which will for them be a quick, immediate change thing with a proven bit of technology with the Scots helping out. Nice one.
Very nice.
We need stuff like that. Back to Alex Salmon's fairly genius set of big announcements. We need to not be stuck in the situation that Keir Starmer has been stuck in, where he's gotten, there's no goodies on display because there's been nothing thought of. And if you can't I'm not asking people to conjure up thin, inadequate solutions, but a kind of good solution is to start to move towards something where you put a citizens' assembly together and get them to chew a problem that the politicians are basically frightened of solving. So somewhere along the line, there needs to be something a bit special, and there needs to be independence, because you will get stuck constantly. The people in the end that are hurt by the Scottish Parliament being underwhelming are not its authors, the Labour Party, who've, pretty much out of the equation though. It's eventually, it hurts the SNP. The longer they're in charge of it, the more they own it. And if they're owning a dog that can't run, then that is going to come back really to look like a reflection on independence, when it should be exactly the opposite.
Well, on that note, folks, having had the bumper post-election edition of the pod, we will see you cough-free, hopefully, and cart-wheeling next week, chums. Take care.